let me move to introduce our speaker for our first session, which is leading safe churches. If we're asking ourselves what kind of church do we need to be, we start by being safe churches, and this is absolutely essential. Presenting is Mike Sloan, Director of Safeguarding for Grace, which is godly response to abuse in the Christian environment. I've served on that board since 2011, and I've known Mike the entire time. For the last 13 years, Mike has trained churches, schools, and other Christian ministries across the United States and abroad in abuse prevention and response best practices. Mike worked with Grace board member, my colleague Victor Veith, in developing the Grace Seminary curriculum. It's a first 3-credit-hour seminary course on child maltreatment, which was piloted in 2017. It was his work there that became an example for me for the course I developed called Abuse in the Church, where I've taught at 5 different seminaries and as recently as last week for a doctorate of ministry program. In our own diocese, Mike has reviewed and updated our safe church policies, and he created what I requested and called for a known sex offender policy for our churches. So plans are already underway for Mike to provide for our diocese in-person training annually and Zoom training for all of the leaders in our diocese who would like to be there and learn from him and me. And so you'll be seeing a lot more of Mike in the future. And so this is a great place for him not only to minister to us and lead us, but for you to get to know him. And also be sure to check out the Grace Table later on. But Mike has served as a pastor in congregations in Atlanta, Georgia, and Columbus, Ohio. So please join me in welcoming Mike Sloan.
Good morning, everyone. It is a real privilege to be here. Thank you, Bishop. Thank you to the diocese for this invitation. We have been working on your policies, and it's a wonderful thing to stand before you today and say, we're going to continue this work and this conversation about leading safe churches. So as Justin said, forgive me, I've always known him as Justin. We've known each other for a long time, and Justin's been an amazing supporter of our ministry, Grace. We at Grace have the privilege of working, as he said, with churches around the U.S., around the world, in this calling to see us be the type of church that Christ calls us to be, a safe church for all. And so I want to give you some very practical ways to think about that today, whether you are clergy, whether you are lay people. Let's have a conversation about that. And then I plan to be here, not just today, but tomorrow as well. And I hope you'll come. Those of you who haven't come yet, come over and talk to us at our table. We all know the words of Christ where he said, "They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves." In this context, Jesus is talking about someone who is a part of the faith community. And he's talking about someone who has a bad intention. But they are there in the community of faith, appearing just like everyone else, speaking like everyone else, leading in prayer. In this context, it is a leader. And that is the very hard reality when we think about safety that we have to begin with and wrap our heads around. That most often, this is someone who is known and trusted within our faith community. And this is the reality that Jesus warns us about and calls us to account for in our mentality and our policies and how we live that out as a community. It's very comforting to me as a Christian to read what current researchers on abuse will say today. People like Anna Salter, who have spent years researching abuse and offending and what offenders do and what are their strategies. And she says they will approach it in the same words that Jesus said, essentially. What she's saying is essentially what Jesus said, is that most often it's someone who we would think of would never do that kind of thing. And she talks also about that there are settings, there are it's a culture, it's a mentality in any kind of environment, in any kind of community. There are dynamics that those who are bad actors will try to take advantage of. And this would include faith communities. And in our faith communities, we have this wonderful community and fellowship and trust in one another. And of course, most of the time, that is just a wonderful, beautiful aspect of our communities. And yet there are bad actors who will take that and who will twist it and who will weaponize it. So we have to be aware of that. One of my mentors and a fellow board member at Grace, alongside Bishop Holcomb, Dr. Langberg, she says that there are those who are bad actors who will recognize the systems where the leadership will prioritize the system over the individual. And so we have to be safe churches, places where children, the elderly, those with disabilities, any person is held up as a valuable image bearer of God and is worthy of protection. And it is not the systems that are most important to us. It is not the ministry that is most important to us, but it is the command of Jesus to protect and to care. And that is always the priority. Leaders, we especially have a responsibility in forging the way with safe churches in our work, because we not only work and do training and policy work with churches, we also do consultation. So alongside my colleagues, we are working with churches in really difficult circumstances where harm has been done week by week. And we see a lot of stories where churches are struggling to respond to these issues well. At the same time, we are so encouraged in this work because we see leaders, including like some here, who are actually committed to being proactive and doing what needs to be done. And faith leaders, it is upon us to lead in this area. Make no mistake, our churches will never be safe until this is a priority for us as clergy and lay leaders in the church. This must be our task and our responsibility. Let me just back up for a moment and say, when we talk about the word abuse, what do we mean? Here's a general definition that we use in our training very often. We say that abuse occurs, and this is a very general definition. It occurs when a person holding power in some form and trust in some form uses that power and trust to exploit or violate a person who is more vulnerable in some way. And of course, that can be in any kind of way that we're human. It can be physical abuse or sexual abuse or spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. And there's a critical distinction. In the church, we talk about, we're all fallen and fall short of the glory of God. We're all sinners. In abuse, though, it is not about two people sinning. It is one person using power and trust and weaponizing that against another person, exploiting them, violating them in some way. And it is about someone being sinned against. And so if we don't get that to the core of our being, when we respond to that person who has been harmed, if we're putting any percentage of responsibility upon them as we respond to them, we will be doing harm. So we have to have this critical distinction in our churches that abuse involves a perpetrator and a victim. It involves someone sinning and someone being sinned against. And if we don't have that clear in our minds, we will do harm as we respond. Now, I want to talk proactively, and I know some of you may have the handout, the packet that was sent out, but I want to just do some interaction. We're going to have some microphones that will go around, and I want to talk about this main idea that to have safe churches, we have to work on a culture of protection, that this involves all of us. I say this all the time in churches. Everyone in a church community, whether it's a parish or a ministry or whatever the setting, it's any kind of community, not just a faith community also. Anyone who's a part of that community is contributing to that place being a place of safety and respect. It takes all of us contributing to that together. So I want to just walk through an exercise, a little scenario, and I want you to interact over this. And let's talk about this main idea that it takes all of us to engage in a culture of protection. So let's just envision for a moment what that would look like. So please raise your hand if you want to contribute to this. So I'm going to read a very short scenario. And unfortunately, in our experience, in our ministry, we know this is a made-up scenario, and yet it's not. Things like this do happen. So here is the scenario. A man starts to give a lot of attention to a middle school girl after worship each Sunday. He finds a place to interact with her in the hallway and eventually gets her cell phone number. He is observed interacting with this girl in a fixated way, including physical contact that's not sexually abusive at this point, but it is inappropriate. Multiple adults see this happening at different times. They notice it. They're concerned. However, none of them serve with minors in the church and thus do not have any training in child protection. And they've not been briefed on the church policy in this area. The church has a policy for structured ministry with students and with children, but nothing in place for unstructured times like this in the hallway after worship. This man begins texting with this girl, eventually texting sexually explicit communication and content. This child abuse scenario was very preventable. So here's the question for you, and let's talk about this together. So raise your hand. What could church leaders have done ahead of time to bring effective prevention to this scenario? What could be in place ahead of time for this to have been prevented? What are some thoughts? Let's just get some ideas out there. What would you say?
Maybe something like, if you see something, say something, and to not be afraid to. So many times in church we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings or saying something negative, but if there were a safe place to go to share that information.
Excellent. Did you hear what she said? Just a mentality that it's our duty to speak up if there is a concern, right? However we say that, that's critical. So having a policy that, that has something about what is appropriate versus inappropriate, but it's often the missing piece is that piece of empowerment. That, hey, it is upon us as a body, us as a faith community to speak up when needed. Very good. Okay, what else?
I was wondering if you could have had something like a training session for the people in the church, maybe in the parish hall on, between services or something on a Sunday. And once you make a large group of people aware, then you empower them to talk about it with other people.
Excellent. Yes. So in most churches, in most parishes, when there is training, it's often very limited who gets training. It's often limited to parish staff or volunteers who work directly with students or children. But in this case, it would be, you can see in the scenario, it's very necessary that why wouldn't we do that within our whole parish? We would want everyone who is a responsible adult to know, hey, if this concerning interaction is going on, I can do something about it. Absolutely. So training would absolutely help with that. Good. Someone else. I see some other hands around. Yes.
Okay, I may have cheated a little because I took the safeguarding recently, but
okay.
I think it's important for people to be aware of it, that if they see something, say something like you said. But having said that, they need to know that when they tell a leader, whether it's the rector or the youth director or whoever it is that's in charge, it is out of their hands. They don't have to take responsibility to confront the individual or to do anything further, because that might keep them from saying anything if they think they need any involvement at all at that point. So to pass the information on to the leader in charge and let that leader handle it.
Right. And for leaders to know, that is a leadership responsibility.
It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So another gap that we see, so just a moment, another gap we see all the time with churches in this area is, okay, there's a policy that outlines what's appropriate interaction. We maybe even give some empowerment and training, but there's also just a very simple step of people knowing, who do I talk to about this? And that is something parishes must do, is clarify, if you see a concerning interaction, yes, you may not feel safe to intervene and remind someone of the appropriate boundaries or the appropriate policy. So who do I go to? Who handles that? And to make that very clear and very specific, and to have, I would say a team of men and women, so that you just make it as easy as possible within a parish, that people can choose someone they feel comfortable, but there is a concrete designated group of people to go to in that case. Okay, maybe one more, and then we'll keep going. Yes?
So in a church that has difficulty finding people to work with youth and children,
Right.
a couple things I thought of. One was, why not educate the children and the youth about who should have their cell phone number and how adults should interact with them?
Yes.
And who should be interacting with them. I think it wouldn't hurt to have an educational session with them specifically.
Absolutely. Well, and we need to have people who are, interacting with children outside of structured ministry, but certainly within structured ministry, who are safe people, meaning they know what the appropriate standards are for interacting with minors, and they respect those boundaries. So having people who have responsibility in that way, who understand that. But I like what you said also about having a talk about safety with the students themselves. And for many students, they're not going to, like in this scenario here, many middle school students are not going to be able to see the manipulation or the grooming or what have you that's going on. However, it may be their friend or another student who sees, why is this man interacting with you in this way? And for there to be empowerment, not just for the adults to speak up, but for the students as well. All of those are really critical aspects. Now, let me just stop for a moment and say, do you notice all those things we've talked about and all those things you've mentioned, which I say are amazing and essential? I don't think any of those things are controversial. I don't hear anything anyone has said and think, well, that just sounds like a far out idea that would just never work, or that's too difficult. No, all of those things seem very common sense. And yet, those things do not happen unless we are proactive and follow through. Training and safety talks, empowerment and clarity about where and whom to speak up to if there is a boundary issue, someone interacting in a concerning way. And what we need is that this is a mentality and a culture and identity that we live out our Christian faith together. And this is about who we are as a community. So whether we're in lay leadership or we're clergy, we must nurture that culture, that mentality of protection. And of course, and Bishop mentioned, we've been working on revising your policies. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of policies? Policies are what? Fun? No? Policies are what? Policies are tedious. No one reads them. How do we get people to read them? Absolutely. I mean, it is difficult, right? They're a challenge. They're difficult to get people to read. They're tedious. All of those things. Absolutely. But policies are essential. Just think back to the scenario that I just laid out. If there is, a policy about, look, this type of touch and physical interaction, very familiar touch between adults and children, in the unstructured time of the church. If there is clarity that that's a boundary, that absolutely helps us in our ministry, because then we can step in concretely and say, hey, remember the safe behavior and the safe boundary. And we reinforce that and we live it out together. And it's not about a culture of paranoia. That's not what we're after. But when we set a few key boundaries in place and everyone is invested that this is who we are and this is how we live out our faith as a community, we don't have to be paranoid or live in fear, at worship each week. We are building trust within those boundaries week by week. And it is common, unfortunately, in Christian communities. I mean, study after study shows abuse is more common than most of us realize. Now, of course, when it's connected to a faith community, that doesn't always mean it's happening at the church property. In fact, most abuse connected to churches happens in more unstructured times and in homes. And this is across all forms of abuse, whether it's children or elder abuse or those with disabilities and so forth. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, whatever type of abuse we're talking about. Effective policies, though, are holistic, and they're going to account for the actual reality, not just focus on what's happening on our property or the structured times of ministry. So that's another key thing. I'm not against insurance. Please have insurance. I'm not against having legal counsel. Please have legal counsel and seek that as needed. And our ministry, by the way, was founded by an attorney, Bas Javidjian, who is from Central Florida. But an attorney said, who works in this area, for churches to do the smart thing, doing the right thing is the smart thing. It's the same thing. And so taking this culture-based approach to safe churches and focusing on holistic policies, not just policies that focus on risk management. In risk management, what is the focus? Protecting what? It's protecting the institution. A faith-based and a culture-based approach, and that gets back to what is our faith community at its heart? What are our values? Who are we at our core? And we would argue it is living out our Christian faith as a people of faith. And that means the ministry, the system would never take priority over a child, over any person within our parish. Think about, these scenarios, and I put some of these in the handout if you want to reference them. Let me just read a couple. There are, for the sake of time, let me just go to just give you some of the common gaps we see in policies from when parishes take an approach that we would argue is focusing more on risk management. We want, and this is where your diocese and the work we've done on your policies is working toward these more holistic policies. And so I'm excited to continue that work with you all. A huge gap we see in so many parish policies and diocesan policies is that it's only focused on child abuse, not intimate partner violence, not elder abuse, not other forms of abuse that unfortunately are common. We need expectations for conduct. In other words, safe interactions, safe boundaries. And that needs to be something that we live out as a matter of our Christian faith at all times. It's not only for staff and volunteers who have formal charge of students for 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week. It is at all times. It's before and after and in the hallways and in the parking lots and in the restrooms. And when we have events at homes and events off sites, it's everywhere we go because it is a matter of taking our Christian faith and living out our Christian faith. So again, it's behavior off property. It's prayer meetings in homes and other places and Bible studies, not just on church property. And it's basic conduct expectations for all in the faith, not just staff and volunteers. And it's adult abuse as well as child abuse. And as was mentioned, training for the whole community, not just staff and official volunteers. And when we think about reporting issues, whether it's vulnerable adults or children, where there is a mandate legally, absolutely. But even when we state that in our policy, that yes, we are legally obligated to report abuse in certain cases, we should always ground that also in our Christian ethics, that we have a call to speak up for those who are vulnerable and those who cannot speak up for themselves. So it is about a culture and broadening this to be something that we view, and I think that will help us with policy, not just being a dry policy that we have to read, that we have to check off a box, but it's about living out our Christian faith and identity. I'll never forget a pastor I know. It was in a different tradition. And he called me one day. I was coming to his church to do a training. And he said, Mike, I need to talk to you about an issue before you come. Can we set up an appointment and talk about this? And I said, of course. And so I said, what's going on? He said, well, here's what's happening. At worship every Sunday, after the benediction, and I bless and dismiss the congregation, some children have started running up to give me hugs. And he said, I'm concerned about this. And I said, okay, why are you concerned? He said, well, you know. And I said, no, I don't know. Nothing you're describing concerns me at all. Safe churches is not about a mentality of paranoia. It's not, don't touch kids, don't talk to kids. That's not what we're after. By the way, children need healthy affection within boundaries to develop in healthy ways. Please talk to children. Please interact with them within healthy boundaries. And so I told him, I said, look, if you were going up to children and giving hugs that were unwanted, or women or anyone, I would be concerned about that. But that's not what you're doing. They want to give their pastor a hug. That's wonderful. You're not taking them down the hallway away from everyone else to your office alone. That's not what's happening. I would be concerned about that kind of isolation. But that's not what you're doing. But these kids care about their faith community. They care about their pastor, their priest. And that is a wonderful thing. Now, as we've worked on your policies, how do we get that policy and this culture we're talking about? What are some basic things that we can do to make sure this is about living out our Christian faith? The key is always going to be, for me, that faith grounding. To make sure people know this policy is about loving our neighbor as ourselves. It is an extension of how we live out our Christian faith. That's all our policy is. And that's what our faith leads us to. We want children and other vulnerable people to be safe as a matter of Christian priority in our church. And so grounding that in our faith is the most effective way to get people to pay attention to the policy. So for you all here, you have a policy as a part of belonging to this diocese. But the key is, how do we get people to buy in and to own it and understand it and see it as something that is worthy of their attention? Well, again, we do this by showing this was the priority of Jesus. Can you think of any stronger words of Jesus of condemnation for those when he talked about those who harm children? There are very strong words of Jesus. Can you think of stronger words of condemnation than when Jesus talked about those who would hurt those who are vulnerable people who are more elderly? Think about this passage just for a moment. What kind of abuse is this, by the way? We have our modern categories of abuse that Jesus didn't use the same. It was a different time. They didn't have the same categories always in language. But what is he describing here? Just think about this passage where he says, beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Can someone just call it out? What kind of abuse might we call this? It's financial, absolutely, because it involves property and material goods, absolutely. So we could call this financial abuse. But what else could we call it? We could call it elder abuse. Now, just like today and in the day of Jesus, not all widows were elderly, but many, if not most, were, absolutely. So absolutely, this could be called elder abuse. What else could we call it? Spiritual abuse. Why could we call this spiritual abuse? I would also argue it's clergy abuse. And those are connected. Because who are the ones doing this? Who are the ones exploiting these vulnerable widows? It's someone who has a formal position of leading in prayer in the faith community. Whatever categories, we would apply to that, there is some aspect of formal leadership and authority. And it is using that spiritual position, authority, that is being weaponized. Do you see that? How do they know which widows are vulnerable? Which ones have property that could be taken? It's only because they have the access and presence and trust, and then they're weaponizing that power and trust to exploit, to take. So absolutely, I would argue this is a form of spiritual abuse. And so just in this one passage in our modern categories, and I would argue the previous passage, oh, by the way, in the context, Jesus uses that language. It's not in the slide here, but you know the language. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, right? It's unforgettable language, right? It's very, scholars will point out, most often that language of if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Most of the time, that language in that day referred to sexuality because it was the eye of lust. It was the hand that groped sexually. When Jesus used that language earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, what was he talking about, by the way? He was talking about sexuality. So when he talks about children and those who would harm children and brings that language up again in a Greco-Roman culture where pederasty, was a very common practice of men, mentoring boys, but also there was sexual violation of those boys. In that type of culture of exploitation, for Jesus to bring up that language and talk about the harm towards children, almost certainly there's a very strong contextual argument that Jesus is condemning the exploitation of children, in particular the sexual exploitation of those children. And here I would argue, again, we have Jesus very directly condemning elder abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, and clergy abuse in the strongest possible language. I'll never forget at a parish training, it was one of the first trainings I ever did. It was about 14 years ago. And a woman came up to me in a break in the training and she said, Mike, I've been in church all of my life. And I would guess she was probably in her 80s, if I had to guess. She said, I'm a victim of child sexual abuse in the church. And I've been in church all of my life, and I've never heard a pastor talk this way about God's heart for the abused, about the priority of our faith in standing against abuse and exploitation. But she said, when you talked about Jesus' words and Psalm 9, which talks about that God is a refuge, a place of stronghold for the oppressed, the exploited, she said, my heart soared. And that's what I want for all of our parishes, all of our faith communities, that message is clear for. And many survivors in our parishes, their exploitation was not connected to clergy or to our church. It was connected to their home or some other setting. But in our parishes, what do they need to hear? And that also contributes to safety because they hear it being spoken about. They know if there is a concern, if there is a need to speak up, I will be heard. I will be responded to with care. So, grounded in our faith. Another thing is, again, that I've been belaboring the whole time, forgive me, but the policy must be holistic. And that's what we've been working on. So I'm not going to say more about that, but you know what I would say, right? It has to cover not just children, but adults and different forms of abuse, not just the risk management policies tend to focus mainly on child sexual abuse in the structure programming of the parish. And that's just not enough. We need to broaden what we're doing. And of course, as we've said, we need to empower the whole community to live out the policy. The key here is I don't think it's complicated. It is simply about framing it positively. So it's not about we don't lead with just tons of scary statistics and scary stories. We have to talk about this and frame it in a positive way and always do that work of connecting it to our Christian faith. And leaders, we make the difference. Again, clergy and lay leaders. Imagine a rector standing up in the parish and praying and saying this, sending out a ministry team, and before we send out and pray for the ministry team, the rector says something like this. Okay, before we pray this morning, I just want to say that God cares deeply about our children here in this parish and in our community. And God cares not only about the children, but each person here. As your leaders, you need to understand that we care deeply that our parish is a place of safety and respect for all, especially those who are vulnerable. This is at the heart of what it means to live out our faith. This is at the heart of who God is. God is a refuge for the abused and the vulnerable. For us to use that positive language and that language of our faith, that is a non-negotiable of a safe environment, because it's about all of us together, and it's about each person knowing, if I have to do that hard thing of speaking up about a concern, someone is going to listen to me, someone is going to take me seriously. So I would ask you in leadership, it's not about creating new things, it's how do we already communicate? What avenues for teaching and communication are we already using? We must have this type of language and communication about safety and safeguarding in that type of language and teaching and communication. How can we further speak to these issues? What structures do we have in place and modes of communication? And again, can we frame it positively and connect it to our Christian faith? That will always make a huge difference. Effective policies and getting started. And for you all, I would say it's more at this point, we've worked hard on revising policy. It's now about implementing. And so developing a team, and I'm glad to talk with you more about this at the table, talking with us about it. How do we, what questions do you have? What obstacles do you see? How do we get people engaged? Develop a team to work on that is highly recommended. It can't, in our view, simply be the goal or the passion of one individual. It has to be something we commit some people resources to. And, work on accessibility. There is in the handout, if you downloaded it or if you go and download it after, it's less than a page. It's not even a full page. It is a summary of a very thorough parish policy that gets at all the core issues we've already raised, why we're doing this, and how it connects to our Christian faith. A few key boundaries, not just for the volunteers with students in the 3 hours of the ministry per week we do directly with students, but for everyone at any time. A few basic key boundaries. Empowerment and who to talk to if there is a concern, if those boundaries are being tested. Because that's honestly, and let me just pause and back up for a second, that's what a lot of grooming behavior actually is, by the way. When there is grooming of children or others, grooming is essentially trying to go up to a boundary of what's appropriate and test it to see, can I take it further? With touch or communication or isolation? Can I take it further past what's appropriate? Is anyone watching? Is anyone noticing a concern? How is the child responding, for example? Is there a vulnerability here? Is there an opportunity here? That's essentially what a lot of grooming tactics actually are, is going up to the line of what's appropriate and trying to find a way to cross over while maintaining secrecy and obscuring the intention of that bad actor. When we have a few key boundaries and empowerment for the whole community, we're just in a much stronger position to notice that, to reinforce the healthy and safe behavior so that it does not go further. So we have to work on, though, that accessibility, that this is about our whole parish. It's about how we live this out together. And look, these issues, they don't change overnight. We have to continue to work and make incremental progress. That takes time. It takes an investment of resources, but it is worth it. Not going to say much about policy sections. You'll see all these sections, including the one the bishop mentioned, that we've added a known offender policy. That's another area that we see parishes, churches miss all the time. A known offender comes to the leadership and says, well, here's my story. I want to be a part of this community. And they tell the story of their history. And we see often leaders not doing the due diligence to look at records that are public. Many churches we consult with, if they had simply checked the public records and taken 10 minutes to do that, they would have seen this offender is lying to us. And anytime you have a known offender minimizing what they've done, excusing it, putting blame on others, or flat out lying about it, they're sending a very clear signal that they're still a danger to others. And churches need to be very careful in those situations. So again, it comes back to, what does it say about our values? Now, we do a leadership training, and God willing, we'll be doing this training within the whole diocese at some point in the next 2-3 years. When we train leaders, it's about, again, a culture of protection. And in our view, there's just a few critical areas for lay leaders and clergy to keep in mind in that culture. And so we have a 4-hour training, so we're not going to do that here, but I wanted to give you this framework. Again, to me, these ideas, it's not rocket science, but it is something we must invest in and follow through. Due diligence really matters in this area. We have to connect these issues to our Christian faith. Our parish, everyone must know, hey, this is a non-negotiable, being a safe place, treating others with respect. It is a non-negotiable because this is about living out our Christian faith. So in that training, we will be talking about how do we help everyone in our parish understand that mentality and come forward with us in that priority. We must raise the education level. And I love what some of you all said in the interaction. Yes, it's education for the whole parish. It's education for the students and the children to know how should they be interacted with and treated. By the way, when we do that with children and students, we're not just helping them to know how they should be treated by the adults. That's critical. What else are we doing? We're helping those students and children know how they should be treating their peers and how they should be treating younger children and how the older children should be treating them. And that's another gap, by the way, in policies, is that a significant amount of abuse against minors is perpetrated by who? By other minors, by their peers or older children. And it's about socializing them into healthy and safe behaviors. So education that accounts for the children themselves and the adults, even if the adults don't serve as formal volunteers in the student ministry or the children's ministry. We want to bring education. And we want that education to be taken wherever our parish members go, right? Wherever they go. And into their work, into their families and into their homes. That is that mission that the bishop mentioned, and taking that out and taking it further. Boundaries. Again, in that policy summary, a few key boundaries. That touch should be welcomed. Touch with the vulnerable, like children, should be accountable, right? The pastor who was concerned, I wasn't concerned about what he was describing. Why? Because it was out and public and open, and the children wanted to give their priest a hug, their pastor a hug. Wonderful. A few key boundaries for the whole community. That really matters. But the key there, again, is what do we do if those boundaries are being tested? And are there paths of accountability? And we don't want to overreact. Again, it's not about a culture of paranoia. And many people in a parish will be reluctant to speak up because they don't want leaders to overreact, and they don't want to judge someone's intentions or motivations. It's perfectly understandable. So when we have a few clear boundaries, everyone knows, oh, this is something as a community we are all committed to. These are part of our policies, they're clear, and that is what we're invested in. And those boundaries are not just random things we've made up. It's the actual boundaries that many times in grooming or other tactics that are trying to be tested by those who are bad actors. So isolating a child, for example, unwelcome touch, sexual conversation and communication. Those things are bright lines, are key boundaries of healthy interactions. And so when those are understood by our community, we give people encouragement and empowerment that, look, we're not going to overreact, but we are going to be determined and insistent to reinforce those few healthy boundaries within our community. Of course, protocols for when abuse comes to light, and that's not only within something that happens on site, on our property. If a child discloses something happening at home. Again, I know of multiple cases where physical abuse or emotional abuse, cruelty, psychological cruelty was disclosed at church, but the parish didn't have the policy in place or the training in place for the adults who receive that information from the child to know what to do with it. So thankfully, again, your diocese is working and has these policies that bring clarity to that. It's just about then we have to take it and make sure everyone at the parish level knows what that means and how we respond. Again, we as leaders, clergy and lay leaders, we make the difference. I will point you to our website. I will point you to my email. And my colleague David Pittman is here. David, can you stand up? David's right there in the back. So David and I will be here today. I'll be here tomorrow as well. David helped us, and David is an outspoken survivor of child sexual abuse in the church. And so you can read his story if you just Google his name and go talk to David about his story. And by the way, David, I'm in Virginia, but David's here local in Florida, about 45 minutes away. He's not in this diocese. David, what's your diocese? Southeast. Y'all are neighbors, okay? So David's your neighbor. Please come talk to us. And we have at Grace, we have a wonderful program for parishes. We call it our Safeguarding Initiative. We do this with individual parishes or churches, and it really is about helping you implement and taking that culture forward. Again, we train your leadership, clergy and lay leaders. We train your whole parish. We advise you on those safety talks with children and with students, and we have resources and guides for those things that are very practical and help make it, again, more easy to implement. We come to your property and we talk about safety in your specific environment. We have also just initiated, we just started it the end of last year. We have our very first cohort of churches, 3 or 4, 5 churches together doing that Safeguarding Initiative together. I think it's a wonderful program within a diocese because you have a lot of other churches within your diocese where you have a natural, a connection, affinity, and sometimes even geographically close location to one another, that you can do this together. And doing it together with like-minded churches in your diocese can give you, again, more encouragement, more empowerment that we're doing this together alongside other churches. So I put some information in that handout about that cohort, and we do separate services. If you just want us to help you think about how to implement the diocesan policy, if you have a specific situation you need consultation on, if you just want to do a one-off training, come talk to us. We do all of those as services. That is our very simple mission for the last 20 years that we've existed as a ministry. is we're here to educate and empower churches and ministries to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. So thank you so much. I think we do have a few minutes if you have questions. So just 2-3 minutes here. If you want to raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you. And it might not be a question. It might just be a comment, something that's been prompted in this conversation.
So I'm a newcomer here visiting for the first time, and I was curious as to the things that were in the pew, and there's this very nice postcard in the pew that tells about, welcome to Trinity Church, and there's a couple of QR codes on there, and I went to the, site. It takes you to the church website. I think it would be great to have a small statement or title on this as well, and another separate QR code that talks about we are a safe church. And, it can take you directly to a page on the website that talks about safety first and what all that means for this church. So I think this is one other great, easy, you're already doing it.
Absolutely.
Let's just add to it. The other message it does is if I'm an offender and I come here to visit and I'm looking at this and I see, oh my gosh, look at this. They have a whole thing on being a safe church. And if you see something, say something. That might either prompt me to be open and honest about, my stuff, or it'll prompt me to maybe say, I don't think I should be here. So kind of works on both ends.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful practical idea. And absolutely the policy can, make it known that, hey, because of our policy, if you do have that as a part of your history, we simply ask that you have to be subject to our policy in this area. So please come and talk to us and make yourself known. Absolutely. Okay, yes, please.
I'm just wondering, a member of the clergy finds out that one of the children is being abused at home by a parent. What could they do about it?
Right, so in your policy, we'll actually guide you, the diocesan policy. So any disclosure, any evidence or reasonable belief a child is being abused anywhere, including in their own home, the first step is that would be reported. And that's Florida law, by the way, right? Every adult in Florida is a mandated reporter of child abuse. But then to make the leaders known, make that known to the leaders that report's been made. And we want leaders to then attend to any key issues of safety, issues of appropriate boundaries or accountability. And that'll depend all on the circumstances. Care for the individual child. If it's, let's say it's an older sibling who's doing the abusing, or a parent, or maybe it's their cousin. Again, it'll all depend on the circumstances, but we want appropriate care for that child, and leaders have a responsibility. We're not mental health practitioners. We're not legal representatives. We're not social workers. We're not investigators. So those roles are accounted for in our community, but we have a role as leaders. And within our community, any disclosure of potential abuse is going to raise questions about basic issues and so assessing safety, assessing accountability or boundaries as needed, caring for those within our parish who have been impacted. And it may be, yes, the victim, but it may also be their family as well. And then coordinating with outside resources is another key step in response. So having a child connected to a child advocacy center for their forensic interview, but then that child advocacy center may be able to recommend a specialized trauma counselor who works with children specifically or works with families specifically. There's all sorts of, so those are steps that are already outlined in diocesan policy, but that's a few basic thoughts. There's more to be said, but that's the basic initial response. All right, that's all the time we have for questions, so thank you so much.